The smell of roast chicken and sweet tea filled the dining room, a Sunday ritual that had once felt sacred. I had polished the old oak table, laid out the good plates, and arranged the meal with the same love I'd carried through decades of holding this family together. For me, dinners weren't about food, they were about belonging. But as laughter erupted around me that evening, something in the air shifted. Tiffany. My daughter-in-law leaned back in her chair, her voice slicing through the warmth like a knife. "My Mel smells like pee," she said, laughing at her own cruelty. For a second, I thought I'd misheard her. Then Sophie giggled. Ethan joined in, and even DJ, my only son, lowered his head with a smirk. He couldn't quite hide. Their laughter spread like wildfire. I sat frozen, the napkin crumpling in my hand. Shame seeped into every vein, every breath. The sound of their laughter blurred into a dull ringing in my ears, and all I could do was stare at my plate. Not one of them told her to stop. Not one of them looked ashamed. When the laughter faded, it was replaced by the scrape of forks and the hum of meaningless chatter. I chewed slowly, every bite turning to ash, but I stayed. Walking away would have felt like surrender, and I had already given up too much. That night, after the house had gone quiet, I stood at the sink, staring at the pile of dishes, my hands trembling, not from exhaustion, but from the memory of what I'd just endured in the home I built with my own two hands. I was 28 when Robert died in that textile mill accident back in 1986. One moment, I was folding laundry. The next, I was standing in the break room holding DJ's tiny hand while a foreman stumbled through apologies. From then on, it was just the two of us. I worked the mill by day, cleaned offices by night, and slept when I could. Every dollar went to keeping DJ fed and clothed. In 1992, I bought this little brick house in Greensboro, the first thing that ever had my name on it. By 2005, the mortgage was paid off. This house was proof that grief could turn into something solid if you worked hard enough. DJ never went without. I sacrificed everything, my youth, my rest, my joy, to make sure he never felt the hunger I had. And yet, years later, he let his wife mock me at my own table. The laughter from that night lingered like smoke seeping into the walls. It wasn't just Tiffany's cruelty that haunted me, it was DJ's silence. They had moved in after DJ lost his job in Raleigh. I didn't hesitate to open my door. I told myself it was temporary, just until they got back on their feet. But months became years. The rooms I once cherished grew smaller. Tiffany's perfume filled every corner. Her voice dictated the rhythm of the house. I overheard her once telling DJ it was time to find a place more appropriate for me. He didn't argue. He just grunted as if the idea had been sitting comfortably in his mind all along. Even the children mimicked her tone. Sophie called me slow. Ethan laughed at Tiffany's jokes about the smell of mothballs. I had raised DJ to be kind, but he had married someone who taught him that cruelty was easier than gratitude. I became invisible. The lights, the food, the roof over their heads, all paid for by me. Yet none of them saw it. They ate what I cooked and drank what I poured. But their laughter made me smaller every day. One night, long after they'd gone to bed, I stood at the sink again, my hands gripping the counter until my knuckles went white. I had told myself for years that endurance was love, that swallowing my pride was the price of peace. But standing there, I felt something break. Tears came fast and quiet. I cried for Robert, for DJ, for the woman I used to be before I disappeared into service. When the sobs finally stopped, something else rose in their place. Not anger, but clarity. I was not a ghost. I was Lena, a woman who had built her life, her home, and her family from nothing. And I would not let them strip me of it anymore. The next morning, I moved through the kitchen with the same calm rhythm, making breakfast, packing lunches, nodding as Tiffany scrolled on her phone. But inside, a decision had already taken root. Once the house emptied, I went to my bedroom and opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. Inside were the documents of my life, the deed to the house, the pension statements, the savings records. Proof that everything they took for granted had come from me. This house was mine. It always had been. I packed the papers into a canvas bag and took the bus downtown. Mr. Keller, the bank manager, greeted me kindly, just as he always had. Together, we reviewed my accounts and secured my finances. Tiffany's name was removed from everything. Then I walked 2 blocks to my lawyer's office. I need new documents, I told him. A will that reflects my wishes and protections against anyone trying to control me. He smiled. You're in control, Lena. Walking out into the sunlight, the air felt lighter than it had in years. I held my head high. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't just surviving, I was preparing. The following Sunday came like any other, or at least that's what they thought. I cooked the roast set the cornbread to cool and polished the table until it gleamed. From the outside, everything looked the same. The lace runner my mother made, the blue plates reserved for family dinners, the smell of sweet tea and rosemary drifting through the air. But something in me had changed. My hands were steady, my heart quiet, my resolve ironclad. This meal would be the last time Tiffany sat at my table as if she owned it. They arrived laughing, their voices echoing down the hall before they even took off their coats. Tiffany swept into the dining room like a performer taking center stage, her perfume arriving a second before her words. DJ followed the children, tumbling in behind them. We bowed our heads for grace, and for a brief moment, I hoped naively that maybe tonight would be different. It wasn't. Halfway through dinner, Tiffany wrinkled her nose dramatically and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I swear, it smells like a nursing home in here." The children erupted in laughter. DJ looked down at his plate, his silence an accomplice to every insult. The sound was sharp, shrill, humiliating, and this time, I didn't freeze. I pushed back my chair, the scrape of wood against tile slicing through their laughter. "This is my house," I said, my voice calm but firm, "and Tiffany, you are no longer welcome in it." For a second, the room went completely still. Tiffany blinked, half laughing as if she thought it was a joke. But when I stood and walked to the hall closet, pulling out a roll of trash bags, her face changed. I carried them to her room, yanked open the drawers, and began stuffing her clothes inside. Each thud of a closing drawer echoed like thunder through the house. "Mom, what are you doing?" DJ's voice cracked, but I didn't stop. I dragged the bags through the living room, the children's wide eyes following every movement. Tiffany's protests turned shrill words tumbling out of her in disbelief. But I didn't look at her. I opened the front door, tossed the bags onto the porch, and turned back to face her. "Respect ends here," I said. "You want to laugh at me in my own home? Do it from the street." Her face twisted red and furious. "You're insane," she spat. "No," I said softly. "I'm done." She stomped out, dragging the bags down the steps, her heels clattering on the wood like gunshots. The car engine roared to life, then faded down the street until the house fell silent again. DJ stood in the living room, pale, trembling, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Mom, you didn't have to do that. She was just upset. We can work this out." I crossed my arms steady as stone. "No, DJ. She humiliated me in my own home twice. That was the last time." Sophie tugged at her father's sleeve. "Daddy, who's going to cook now?" she asked softly. Ethan followed his eyes darting between us. And who's going to pay for stuff like Grandma does? Their innocent words cut deeper than Tiffany's cruelty ever could. The truth had slipped into the open through their mouths. DJ swallowed hard, unable to answer. For years, he'd let Tiffany treat me like help while I kept the house standing, paid the bills, stocked the fridge, kept the lights on. Now his children were realizing what he had refused to see. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The food you eat, the roof over your head, the water you drink, all of it comes from me. You may have forgotten that, but I haven't. And now, DJ, it's time you teach your children what happens when you take the person who sustains you for granted. He looked at me, eyes, glassy lips parting, as if to speak, but no words came. The silence said enough. I turned and walked toward my room, leaving him to explain the truth to his children. That night, the house was quiet, too quiet. But it wasn't a silence of fear or shame. It was the silence that comes after a storm when the air is finally clear. For the first time in years, I slept without replaying every unkind word, every dinner, where laughter came at my expense. I slept deeply peacefully, like someone who had finally remembered her own worth. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, as I always had. But instead of heading to the kitchen to cook for everyone, I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table with the papers from my lawyer and banker. The light from the window was soft silver. When the clock struck 9 a.m., I started making phone calls, methodical, precise, calm. Tiffany's name was removed from every account. Automatic payments tied to my pension were canceled. The utilities, the property tax, the insurance, all reverted to my name alone. Every leak they had created in my life was sealed. That afternoon, I met with Mr. Harland again. We finalized my new will. DJ and Tiffany would no longer stand at the center of it. My estate would be divided differently, given to causes that valued dignity, not entitlement. Signing those papers felt like exhaling after years of holding my breath. By the time I walked out of his office, the sun was warm on my face, the air alive with the sound of birds. For the first time in decades, I felt light, untethered from guilt, unburdened by expectation. My freedom didn't come in one grand act of rebellion. It came in the steady realization that survival wasn't about enduring cruelty, it was about reclaiming peace. In the days that followed, the house grew quieter, but it wasn't the lonely quiet that used to ache in my bones. It was the sound of peace settling in. For the first time in years, I wasn't moving to someone else's rhythm. I woke when I wanted. I cooked when I felt like it. I sat on the porch with my coffee and let the morning sun warm my face without worrying about who needed me next. I tended the garden again, pulling weeds from the soil until the earth felt familiar beneath my hands. I planted tomatoes, lavender, and collard greens, things I had always loved but never had time to nurture. Watching them take root reminded me that life could grow again even after years of being trampled. DJ kept to himself for a few days after Tiffany's outburst. When he finally spoke to me, his voice was low and tired. He had found work at a local auto shop. It wasn't the office job he once had, but it was honest work. His hands came home stained with grease, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion, but I saw something new in him, a humility that had been missing for a long time. Tiffany returned one evening, dragging her bags back up the porch steps. She didn't speak to me. Her face was tight, her pride bruised. I didn't stop her from entering. This time, I didn't have to. The power she once held in this house had already been stripped away. My finances were sealed. My documents secure. She could walk through my doors, but the home no longer belonged to her world of control and disdain. The children were different, though. Their cruelty had been borrowed from the adults around them, and children can unlearn faster than grown hearts can change. Sophie began following me into the kitchen, her curiosity soft and cautious. She watched me knead dough and asked questions about recipes that had once filled this home with laughter. I taught her to fold biscuits and stir gravy, her small hands trembling as she learned. Ethan spent time in the garden, pulling weeds beside me with quiet focus. When I thanked him, he looked up and said, "I like it when it's quiet, Grandma." Their innocence reminded me why I had stayed patient for so long. Not for DJ or Tiffany, but for the hope that the next generation might see love differently. Slowly, the sharpness in the house dulled. The laughter that once mocked me became laughter of simple joy, the kind that doesn't sting when you hear it. At Mr. Harlan's suggestion, I updated my will again. The house, the savings, the modest investments they wouldn't pass blindly into ungrateful hands. DJ would not receive anything outright. Instead, the assets would be managed through a trust with clear conditions. If he could prove stability, kindness, and responsibility, the support would come. If not, it would skip directly to Sophie and Ethan when they were grown, provided they earned their own living and treated others with dignity. It wasn't punishment. It was protection for them and for the legacy I had built. I didn't tell DJ about the will. Some truths don't need to be spoken to take effect. What mattered was that I had finally written my story on my own terms in ink that no one else could alter. Weeks passed, and spring settled over Greensboro. The garden bloomed, and with it came a lightness I hadn't felt in years. At church, I joined the women's fellowship group, something I had avoided while Tiffany lived under my roof. Those afternoons filled with chatter hymns and shared casseroles became a balm I hadn't known I needed. I began hosting gatherings again, not for family, but for neighbors and friends who appreciated the kind of warmth that comes without cruelty. When I decided to host a community dinner at my home, I didn't do it to prove a point. I did it because I wanted to. I spent all Saturday in the kitchen humming to myself while cornbread baked and stew simmered on the stove. The house smelled like belonging again, not bitterness. Women from the fellowship helped set the table, their laughter soft and kind. DJ arrived late, a store-bought pie in his hands. He looked around the dining room at the faces of people who respected me, and something in him shifted. He didn't say much, but I caught the flicker of regret in his eyes. Tiffany stood beside him, quieter than I'd ever seen her. The children ran to me with excitement, eager to help. Sophie carried sweet tea to guests. Ethan arranged napkins with care. When everyone gathered, I stood at the head of the table, offering a simple prayer of thanks. My voice didn't tremble. I looked around and saw people listening, not out of obligation, but out of respect. For the first time in a long while, my home was full of laughter that warmed rather than wounded. Later that night, after everyone had gone and the dishes were drying in the rack, I sat by the window with a cup of tea. The garden shimmered in the moonlight, and I thought about how far I'd come. Years ago, I cried at this same sink, crushed by humiliation and invisibility. Now I sat surrounded by peace. I didn't need revenge or apologies. What I had gained was far more powerful self-respect, independence, and a voice that no one could mock again. Life had taught me a hard truth. Love without respect is servitude, and endurance without boundaries is just another form of silence. I had spent too many years mistaking survival for love. Now I understood that real strength isn't in how much you give, but in how much you refuse to lose of yourself while giving. The woman they laughed at had vanished. In her place stood the woman who built the house, paid every bill, and finally reclaimed her seat at the head of her own table. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what would you do if laughter turned into cruelty in your own home?